I think that the primary goals of biblical scholarship in a church context are firstly to encourage people to read the Bible for themselves and explaining why the Bible is important for Christian faith and practice. Another goal would be to introduce people to helpful resources and tools that will help them to gain a deeper understanding of a given scriptural text, taking into consideration the historical, literary, and cultural context in which it was written. In a church setting, I like using video materials for this purpose, as unfortunately few people in our age seem to really love reading books, especially non-fiction, but almost everyone likes to watch a video. Then I would springboard into a discussion with open-ended questions and acknowledgement that no one has all the answers. The ultimate goal is to hopefully influence ourselves and others towards what Paul wrote in Philippians 3:10-11. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. I think that the primary goals of biblical scholarship in a seminary or university context are to try to know and understand what the authors were saying in the historical, literary, and cultural context in which they were written, within the broader framework of the ancient Near East, as Ralston says. It is important to utilize all of the tools and resources available, including studying biblical and other Near Eastern languages, comparative study of culture, religions, literature, etc., from the time periods in which the Bible was written, and keeping current with archaeological discoveries and other research, all of which are widely available to anyone who desires to utilize them. It's good to cultivate a mindset of being a lifelong learner, choosing to be a lifelong learner in community with others, and bravely entering the great conversation, no matter who we are. Some of the specific challenges of negotiating between these different contexts include remembering to not speak too obliquely about obscure topics in a church setting, since the average churchgoer is likely unaware or under-aware of theological nuances, conversations, or debates in more academic circles. It's also wise to not unnecessarily stir the pot in church circles by blurting out conclusions too quickly that were reached over long periods of study and consideration, along with wide reading of sound scholarship. Rather, it seems wiser to gently, carefully, and slowly introduce new thoughts on familiar but possibly misunderstood scriptures. Being too hasty to share fresh approaches to long-held interpretations could have devastating results. Better to lead people towards discovering truth rather than just hit them over the head with it, and none of us has perfect or complete understanding of truth anyway. I have found it helpful to quote from very accessible theologians, for example, N.T. Wright, Henry Nouwen, or Thomas Aquinas, who have both impeccable credentials and clear communication. I frequently suggest that someone read a Wright or Nouwen book, but would only in rare cases where someone has a lot of time on their hands and a huge amount of motivation, suggest that they read Aquinas. I have found it to be very unhelpful to refer to secondary, often popular source materials that adhere to a very narrow or closed political or ideological view, as they seemingly tend to make blanket statements or sweeping claims without offering sound evidence. When others quote from such materials, I try to ask gentle, well-worded questions that hopefully help others to think more critically about the importance of justifying claims with real evidence. I have encountered the issue of questions about traditional authorship of biblical texts before. It seems to me that people who engage frequently with serious biblical study at a seminary or university level are not as bothered about these kinds of discussions, whereas Christians who show up at a Bible study or small group might be alarmed to discover that these things are not as clear-cut or straightforward as they may have thought. For those reasons, I try to tread very carefully when even mentioning questions of authorship, so as not to unnecessarily cause angst or doubt about more central faith issues. Whenever these kinds of conversations come up, I also try to remind those present that our faith is very solidly based on the person of Jesus Christ, about whose life, death, and resurrection there is a preponderance of evidence, and that questions regarding authorship of biblical texts are secondary issues, such that no matter what we discover, there is no reason for us to be distressed. I think that the most important things to focus on when ancient traditional authorship attributions and academic analyses clash is following the path of truth wherever it leads, not becoming derailed or sidetracked emotionally, and avoiding common fallacies or strategies. For example, not disparage one person or group at another's expense to borrow from George Smith's wisdom. As with any area of serious or advanced study, we can't do it alone, so it's important to find reliable sources and companions for the journey. I do think that Christians can productively disagree about these questions. However, doing this via sound bites in social media seems to be a complete waste of time, in my view. It is important to cultivate safe spaces in which to have these kinds of conversations, whether in local cohorts, reasonable conversations, even on YouTube, such as Premiere Unbelievable with Justin Brierley and others, or larger conferences, so as to actually talk about these things and listen well to one another, such that we all grow in wisdom and in understanding. Other critical issues regarding the Old Testament that I hope to understand better through further study is the flood, localized, global, the historicity or not of the person of Job, and how to preach about the imprecatory Psalms. I am fascinated by and hope to read local to me theologian Brent Strawn's work on this.